I want you to stop for a second and think about the last time someone told you something true and you laughed at them. Not because you were cruel, not because you were stupid, but because what they were saying didn't fit the shape of the world you already believed in. Because the man saying it smelled like pine resin and old smoke, and his boots were held together with rawhide cord, and the way he talked about that mountain like it breathed, like it had moods, made the hair on the back of your neck prickle with something uncomfortable. Something that felt dangerously close to being wrong about everything. His name was Koda. He was Apache. He was 61 years old, and for the better part of a decade, every rancher, every trail rider, every weathered soul within 40 miles of the San Andres Range had called him one thing behind his back: a liar. I was one of them. I kept a ledger. I kept it the way other men keep a Bible, close and honest, and sometimes against my own comfort. I logged distances, water sources, pasture conditions, storm forecasts. I logged the dates cattle were born and the dates they died. I logged the names of men I trusted and the names of men I didn't. And somewhere in the middle pages, in handwriting that I'm not proud of today, I had written Koda's name next to a single word: unreliable. I was wrong. This is what it cost us to find that out. The morning it started, I was standing at the fence line watching the sky do something I didn't have a name for. It wasn't the color, though the color was wrong, that flat pewter gray that sits too low and too still, like the light had given up and gone to bed early. It wasn't the temperature, though my breath was fogging in a way it hadn't since February, and it was only the third week of November. It was the silence. The cattle weren't moving. They were just standing there in a loose cluster near the south windbreak, heads down, shoulders touching. My border collie Remnant, 7 years old, never spooked by weather in her life, was sitting with her tail pressed tight against her haunches, looking at nothing. I pulled out my ledger and wrote, Nav, 18, sky wrong, cattle still, Remnant acting unusual, check wire on east pasture. That last part was a lie I told myself. There was nothing wrong with the east pasture wire. I just needed something practical to do so I wouldn't have to keep looking at the sky. I was out by the barn when I heard the wagon. It was Dahlon's rig. I knew it by the squealing axle he'd been meaning to grease since September, and I lifted a hand without turning around. Dahlon pulled up alongside me and sat there a moment before he spoke. Koda was in town again, he said. I kept my eyes on the fence line. When isn't he? He went to Harker's store, said the same thing he always says, said that canyon of his is opening early. Dahlon paused and I heard him shift his weight. Said there's a cave, says it runs deep, says it'll hold livestock. I wrote something in the ledger, I don't remember what. He says this every year, I said. He does. And every year it doesn't amount to anything. Dahlon was quiet for a moment. Harker threw him out. That surprised me slightly. Not the throwing out. Harker was a man of low patience and high suspicion, but that Koda had gone back at all. He'd been turned away from that store 3 times in 2 years. There was a particular kind of stubbornness in returning to a place that had already refused you. I couldn't decide if I respected it or if it annoyed me. What'd he say exactly? I asked. Said the winter's going to come down hard and fast. Said by the end of November, any livestock left in open pasture is going to freeze. Dahlon's voice flattened. Said people might too. I wrote that down. I don't know why. Maybe because even then, something in me registered it differently than all the other times Koda had come to town with his warnings. Maybe because the cattle were still standing motionless in the south corner, shoulders pressed together, not eating, not moving, just waiting. I had first met Koda 7 years prior, in the summer, when I'd been tracking a steer that had gotten through a gap in the northern fence and wandered into the canyon territory. He'd found me before I found the steer, which already told me something about the man, and he'd walked me through a section of the canyon I hadn't known existed, along a dry creek bed that opened suddenly into a wide stone bowl ringed with juniper. He was a lean man, the kind of lean that comes from years of moving on foot across difficult ground. He had a scar along his left jaw that curved toward his chin, and he walked with a slight forward lean, like he was perpetually heading somewhere with purpose. He didn't talk much. What he did say, he said plainly. He told me the canyon held a cave system in its northern wall. He told me his grandfather had known about it, and his grandfather's father before that. He told me it stayed dry in flood and warm in freeze, that the stone held heat from summer far into the cold months, that it ran back far enough to shelter 100 animals if you organized them right. I'd thanked him, retrieved my steer, and ridden home. I told my wife about the cave. She said it sounded like a tall tale. I said I wasn't sure. Then winter came and went without incident, and the cave became one of those things you half remember and half dismiss, until Koda started appearing in town every November with the same warning, and the men started rolling their eyes, and eventually so did I. The ledger entry for that first meeting read, "Canyon Man, Apache, knows the land, cave claim unverified, worth remembering." Somewhere between that entry and this one, I'd stopped remembering and started dismissing. I've thought about that a lot since. By the 21st of November, the snow had started. It wasn't the gentle opening act kind of snow that gives you time to prepare. It came sideways off the mountains with a wind that had teeth in it. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in 6 hours. I know because I logged it. I was logging everything by then, the way you do when you're scared, and the only thing that makes you feel less scared is the scratch of a pencil on paper. By noon the pasture was white and the cattle were invisible from the house. By 4 in the afternoon I couldn't see the barn. I was standing in the kitchen with my wife Emmeline, watching the window fill with white when Remnant started barking, not at the storm, at the door. I opened it and found Koda standing on my porch. He wasn't wearing enough for the cold. A blanket coat, old, patched at the elbows. Boots wrapped with something, cloth, maybe, or cured hide around the ankles to keep the damp out. His hat was powdered white. His face was completely still. "I'm not going to say I told you," he said. "You could," I said. "Wouldn't help either of us right now." He came inside without being fully invited and stood near the stove, not too close, with his hands clasped in front of him. Emmeline looked at me. I looked at the window. Outside, the wind made a sound like something tearing. "How bad?" I asked him. He considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. "Bad enough that cattle left out will be dead before morning. Bad enough that anyone between here and the Mescalero line who isn't in shelter by nightfall won't make it easy." Emmeline set a cup of coffee on the table in front of him. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things they weren't expecting to be offered. "The cave," I said, "it's still accessible in this." "I came through it," he said. "There's a path, I know it, you don't." I looked at him, he looked at me. That was the whole negotiation. I opened my ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date and the time. Then I wrote, Koda, Cave, North Canyon, going. We left within the hour. I didn't have enough time to get word to Dahlan, so I sent Emmeline on horseback to his place. A decision that cost me sleep for the weeks after, letting her ride into that storm, even for a mile. But she was steadier than me in emergencies, always had been, and she made it there and back before we'd finished loading the first of the cattle into the chute. Getting animals moving in a whiteout is not a rational endeavor. It is a negotiation between fear and stubbornness, and the animals generally win the first 3 rounds. The horses were manageable, scared, rolling their eyes, but manageable. The cattle were another story. 3 of them refused to move at all and had to be physically pushed by Dahlan's 2 boys, who'd come with him and who were 16 and 18 respectively, and had the kind of energy only young men in a crisis seem able to produce. Koda was at the front of the group the whole time. He didn't direct us loudly. He didn't point or shout or take charge in the way that announces itself. He just moved and trusted us to follow, and somehow we did. There's a kind of authority that doesn't need to speak at all, and I'd never recognized it in him before because I'd never been cold enough and desperate enough to need it. We went single file along the canyon wall. I was third in line, behind Dalin's older boy and one of his mares. The snow was so thick I could barely see the animal directly ahead of me. I just kept my eyes on the shifting shape in the white and kept moving. At some point the wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped, like a door had been shut. I looked up and realized we were inside. The cave was not what I expected. I think in the small part of my mind that had never entirely dismissed what Koda said, I'd imagined something dark and low and cold. A shelter in the basic sense, protection from wind, nothing more. The kind of hollow you crawl into when there's nothing better and you're grateful for what little it gives. This was something else entirely. The entrance was narrow, single file, turned sideways with the horses, unhitch the supply wagon and bring things in by hand. But 10 feet inside, the passage opened into a chamber that made Dalin's older boy stop walking and just stand there with his mouth open. I nearly walked into him. The ceiling rose 30 feet, maybe more, arching in a natural vault of reddish-brown stone. The floor was dry, not just surface dry, but deep dry. The kind of dry that says no water has touched this ground in seasons, in decades. There were striations in the walls where color had layered over centuries, amber and ochre, and a particular shade of deep rust that caught the lantern light and threw it back warm. At the far end of the chamber, the passage continued deeper, into dark we hadn't yet mapped, but the main room alone could have sheltered twice what we'd brought. And it was warm. Not like a house with a fire. Warmer than that, in a way steadier, without the directional heat of flame. The stone held it, the way Koda had said, and the narrow entrance kept the cold from pouring in. I stood there in my snow-crusted coat and felt the ice in my beard start to melt. Remnant walked to the center of the floor, turned twice and lay down. "She knows," Koda said behind me. "Yeah," I said. I didn't know what else to say. We spent the next hour getting the animals settled. The cattle calmed faster than I would have predicted. Some instinct in them, maybe, or the warmth, or just the absence of wind. The horses were more cautious. They kept looking at the ceiling, but they didn't try to bolt, and after the first little while they put their heads down too. Dalin's younger boy, Finn, the 16-year-old, found a flat section of wall near the back of the chamber and sat down against it with his knees pulled up and his face pale. He'd been moving hard for 2 hours and it had caught up with him. I handed him a strip of dried beef from my saddlebag, and he ate it without speaking, staring at nothing. Koda sat near the entrance, facing the dark outside. He'd been carrying something in his coat all the way from my ranch. I'd noticed the shape of it when we were loading cattle, that slight bulk on his left side that wasn't quite coat. He set it down now, against the wall beside him. It was a bundle wrapped in canvas, tied with a cord. He didn't open it, just set it down. I sat down with my ledger. The wind outside said something that had no words. The cattle breathed. The lantern threw orange light across the stone and I wrote, inside, everyone accounted for. Cave is real. I looked at what I'd written for a long moment. Cave is real. 3 words, but I felt them rearrange something internal, the way setting a dislocated shoulder rearranges pain into relief. Not comfortable, just correct, just honest. Dalin had a question in him the whole first hour. I could see it the way you see weather coming, a pressure building, a restlessness. He kept looking at Koda and then looking away. Finally, around the 2nd hour, when we'd gotten as organized as we were going to get and people were starting to eat and rest, he walked over and sat down across from Koda. "How'd you know?" Dalin asked. Koda looked at him. "The winter. You said it every year, but this year you were right. How'd you know this was the bad one?" Koda was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bundle beside him, then at the chamber ceiling, then at his hands. The way the swallows flew in September, he said, low and moving early, 3 weeks before they usually go. The way the deer came down from the high ground in October instead of November. The way the juniper buried heavy on the south sides. He paused. The silence before the first real cold. There's a particular silence. You have to have heard it before to know it. Dahlin nodded slowly. He was a practical man, not cruel, not dismissive, but built by a life that trusted what it could see and weigh and measure. I could see him trying to fit what Koda was saying into that framework, and finding that the framework was slightly too small. You came to town, Dahlin said, every year. Yes. Harker threw you out 3 times. 4, Koda said. His expression didn't change, but something moved through it quickly, too fast to name. Why'd you keep coming? Koda looked at him with the kind of patience you build not from peace, but from long practice of not saying everything you're thinking. Because people were going to die, he said. That tends to make me keep going. Dahlin looked at the floor. We didn't listen. No. But you came back anyway. Yes. The word sat there between them, not accusation, not absolution. Just fact set down plainly, the way you set down something heavy and don't explain why it was heavy. You just set it down. I wrote in my ledger, D asked why he kept coming. He said, because people were going to die. That tends to make me keep going. I don't know why I wrote it word for word. I almost never do that, but something in me needed it exact, needed it preserved. Around midnight, I was estimating by then, since my watch had fogged in the cold. I woke from a half-sleep to find Koda at the entrance, looking out. The storm was still going. I could hear it, even deep in the rock, not the wind itself, which the stones swallowed, but a vibration in the air, a low pressure that you felt in your teeth and your chest rather than heard. Koda was standing very still, his blanket coat around his shoulders, looking at the white dark beyond the entrance. I got up without thinking about it too much and went to stand beside him. We didn't speak for a while. The cattle breathed behind us. Somewhere deeper in the chamber, Dahlin snored in short rhythmic bursts. How long? I asked, meaning the storm. 2 more days, he said, maybe 3. I absorbed that. We have enough, I said, mostly to myself. He glanced at me sideways. You brought good. You came to my door. I wasn't sure you'd open it. I thought about that. I thought about his name in my ledger, with the single word unreliable beside it. I thought about the 7 winters between that first summer meeting and this night, and all the things I'd chosen to trust instead. I almost didn't, I said. He nodded like I'd said something true, which I had. The canvas bundle, I said after a while. What is it? He reached inside his coat and brought it out again, set it between us. He untied the cord and folded back the canvas. Inside was a drum, small, the kind you hold in one hand, and a medicine bag, and a folded piece of cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old cream. My grandfather's, he said. He brought them here. The last time a winter came like this one, he brought people here too. Apache. And others. He folded the canvas back over the bundle. He said the mountain doesn't care who it shelters. Only that they come. I stood there in the entrance of a cave that had been old before my grandfather was born, listening to a storm that was trying to kill everything it touched, and felt something I didn't have a good name for. The second day in the cave changed people. I don't mean in the large, stated way that people talk about being changed by things. I mean in the small, sideways way that happens when you're removed from everything ordinary and left with nothing but time and other humans and the sounds of animals breathing in the dark. Fen, Dahlin's younger boy, started talking to Koda. Not about anything important at first, just questions, what the striations in the rock were made of, whether the cave went all the way through the mountain or ended somewhere. whether Koda had been inside in the summer and what it was like then. Koda answered each question with the same quality of attention, no more or less than the question warranted. At some point Finn asked, "Did you always know what you know, about the land and the weather and all that?" Koda considered this. "No," he said, "I learned it took a long time." "Who taught you?" "Everyone who was patient enough to let me follow them and watch." Finn was quiet for a moment. "Nobody around here let you do that." "No," Koda said, "so I watched anyway. I was pretending to be asleep on the far side of the chamber when this conversation happened. I don't know why I didn't let them know I was awake. Maybe because listening to it from that sideways angle felt more honest than sitting in it directly." Finn was young enough to ask things that the rest of us were too proud or too guilty to ask directly. "Does it bother you," Finn said, "that they call you?" He stopped. "Yes," Koda said, before Finn could follow up. "It would bother anyone. That doesn't mean it changes what I know." "How do you keep going back to town when they—" "Because it isn't about me," Koda said. And then he said something quieter that I almost didn't catch, and I've been turning it over ever since. "If I stop because of what they call me, then I'm making it about me. And the winter doesn't care about me." I lay there with my eyes closed, and felt the warmth of old stone against my back. On the morning of the third day, the wind stopped. Not the gradual tapering that usually ends a storm, but the full, final stop, like a sentence ending mid. And then quiet. I woke before anyone else. I walked to the entrance and stepped out onto a world that had been completely remade. The snow was chest-high in drifts against the canyon wall. The sky had gone from gray to a pale, exhausted blue. The cold was still vicious but no longer moving. It just sat there honest, without the malice of wind behind it. I stood in it for a long time. Behind me I heard Koda's footsteps on the cave floor. I could identify everyone by their footsteps by then, 3 days in, and then he was beside me. "It's done," I said. "Yes. We can get out today." "This afternoon," he said. "Let the light work first." I nodded. I pulled out my ledger, which I'd been keeping dry inside my shirt for 3 days, and I stood there in the thin blue light and read back through my own entries. From the first entry about the wrong sky and remnant sitting still, through the night Koda arrived at my door, through the hours in the cave. I read the entry that said unreliable 7 years back. Then I took my pencil and crossed it out. I wrote beside it, "Wrong, correct this." It wasn't a grand gesture. No one saw it. The ledger was for me, not for anyone else, and the correction wasn't for Koda or for Dalen or for the winter. It was just the simplest form of honesty I knew how to perform, finding the place where I'd written something false and marking it wrong. We got out that afternoon. The path back through the canyon was slow. The drifts were thigh-deep in places and we had to break trail by hand for the cattle, but we got out. All of us. All of the livestock. One of Dalen's mares had thrown a shoe somewhere in the cave and was favoring her left front, but she walked. Everyone walked. When we cleared the canyon mouth and the open land came back into view, buried in white and impossibly still, Finn stopped and just stood there. Dalen came up beside him and put his hand on his son's shoulder, and Finn didn't pull away, which told me more about how the 3 days had affected him than anything else could have. I looked for Koda. He had stopped about 20 yards back, at the canyon mouth, standing with one hand on the canyon wall, looking back into the dark of the entrance. I walked back to him. "You going back in?" I asked. "In a while," he said. "Why?" "It's where I go." He said it simply, without drama. "I'll come out when things settle." I didn't argue with that. I thought about arguing with it, and then realized it would be the same habit, dismissing what he knew about his own life because I expected something different from it. "Koda," I said. He looked at me. "I'm sorry," I said. "For the ledger thing, you don't know about it, but—" I stopped. 7 years ago I wrote your name down and I called you unreliable, and I crossed it out this morning, but you should know I wrote it." He looked at me for a long moment. "I know you wrote it," he said. "People write things like that. They don't always have to say them out loud." There was nothing in his voice but fact. Not accusation, not forgiveness, not performance of either. Just fact delivered to me like something set gently on a table. I nodded. I didn't know what to say after that, so I said nothing. Back at my ranch, Emmeline was waiting on the porch. She'd stayed 3 days with Dahlon's wife, 3 miles away, which was the right thing to do and which still cost me something when I thought about it. She watched us come up the track, the cattle, the horses, the 4 of us walking, and her face did the thing faces do when the worst fear has just been downgraded to something manageable. Not joy exactly, just the exhale. I went up the steps, and she held my face in both her hands, and looked at me the way you look at someone you thought you might be looking for differently. "Cave was real," I said. "I know," she said. "I always thought it might be." Which stopped me for a moment. "You never said." "You didn't ask," she said, "and it seemed like something you'd need to figure out without being told." I filed this away, alongside everything else. That evening I sat at the kitchen table and opened the ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date and the time, and then sat there for a long time without writing anything else. Remnant was curled by the stove. Emmeline was moving through the house with the efficient, quiet care of someone making sure everything that needs to be checked is checked. Outside the land was white and still and cold, and the stars were back, hard and bright and numerous. I wrote Koda, Apache, correct record not unreliable, opposite. Then I sat there with the pencil in my hand and thought about all the other entries I might have wrong. All the names I'd filed under unlikely or doubtful or proceed with caution, because they didn't match the shape of what I expected. All the things I'd logged as uncertain because certainty was expensive and I was economical with it. I thought about a man who went back to a store 4 times after being thrown out, because the winter didn't care what the store owner thought of him. I thought about a cave that had been keeping people warm since before anyone in my family had set foot on this land. Somewhere out on the white plain, the temperature was still dropping. Spring was months away. There would be more cold, more storms, more ordinary dangers that didn't announce themselves with drama. I picked up the pencil again. The ledger was open, the page was waiting.